Starting off this countdown, we have James Whitey Bulger. James Joseph Bulger Jr., otherwise known as Whitey, was an American organized crime boss and FBI informant wanted by the FBI. He was the boss of a largely Irish mob in Boston from the 1970s through the 1990s. In the early 2000s, the FBI actually decided to seek help from a crime show in Germany. They had them air photos of James and his girlfriend and told people to look out for them, saying that they were extremely dangerous and armed. Except there was one problem with that. They didn't double check the pictures that they sent in to be aired. Soon, calls were flooding in saying that they spotted this dangerous couple. However, the photos the FBI chose to broadcast were of his parents, harmless retirees. So for the next couple of days, they were doing damage control. How embarrassing. That's one reason why the FBI wants you to forget about this case.
Moving on to number 9, we have the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day, a number of shooters gunned down 7 members of the North Side Chicago gang. This is said to be one of the most notable mass killings of the gangster era. Leaked FBI case files reveal information from the case from J. Edgar Hoover, former director of the FBI. One of the things was a letter from Hoover. In the letter he wrote, he believed that a Chicago newspaper had tapped the phones from the Chicago FBI office. This newspaper was always posting up-to-date and exclusive information about the case. How did they get access to this? Potentially by tapping the phones. Or Hoover also suggested maybe there was a mole in the office and that person was leaking the information to the newspaper. He wanted to spread a false rumor around the office and see if it made its way to the press, but he didn't end up doing this. 3 months later, he had the office investigated and found out that their phones were not tapped. Does that mean that there was a mole then? We still don't know. We also still don't know who the men were that committed the Valentine's Day murders. They believe that gunmen came into the area dressed as police officers and pretended to arrest the men before killing them. But no one was ever brought to trial for the murders. It remains one of the biggest unsolved crimes in history. In our 8th spot, we have the Black Dahlia. Now, this is a very famous crime that took place in January of 1947. On that day, Elizabeth Short was found dead in Los Angeles. Her body had been cut in half at the waist and entirely drained of blood, among other gruesome things. Due to the precision of the cut and the lack of mess, it was clear that the killer had experience working with bodies. But to this day, the killer has never been caught, and we don't know why Elizabeth was killed. The FBI report on this case is incredibly detailed, so if you're squeamish, I suggest you don't look it up. In fact, they thought that maybe the killer was actually a police officer, and that's why they could evade the law. To this day, this is one of the oldest unsolved cases in Los Angeles County, as well as one of the most famous unsolved murders in American history. In our 7th spot, we have the racism. Back in 2018, former FBI agent Terry Albury leaked FBI documents that showed the FBI was being racist and was using racial profiling. As a man of color, he was sick of the FBI doing this and decided to show the world how gross it was. He knew the repercussions and he was willing to take them. The leaked documents showed how the agency was using racial profiling in counter-terror investigations and revealed that the Bureau was harassing and intimidating minority communities. As a result of leaking these documents, Terry was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He sacrificed his life to help communities of color. In our 6th spot, we have the files on celebrities. So it turns out that the FBI has a number of secret files on a bunch of celebrities, including Jane Fonda, Elvis Presley, John Lennon, Charlie Chaplin, Michael Jackson, and so on. It's actually insane. They thought that these individuals were all a threat to the US, each having their own different reasons. For example, John Lennon was considered a huge threat for a number of reasons, like his anti-war activities and songs like Give Peace a Chance. Apparently, the Nixon administration did not like this, so in 1971, he was put under surveillance by the FBI. Charlie Chaplin also had a file for alleged ties to the Communist Party. Jane Fonda had a file for connections with anti-war activities, and Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley had files because of extortion attempts against them. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the JFK assassination. Pre-classified JFK assassination documents have just been released, including documents all on his killer, Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, there has been tons of debate over the years. Did he act alone, or was there more than one shooter? Some even think that Oswald worked for the CIA or had ties to them somehow. It's crazy. Well, it was finally revealed after investigating tens of thousands of leads that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Now, could they have altered the documents to make us think this and clear the CIA? For sure. You decide what you want to believe. In our fourth spot, we have the UFOs. In 1972, director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, denied that the FBI ever investigated UFOs or ETs. That was until recently. Leaked files prove otherwise. Shortly after World War II, the FBI joined forces with the Army and the CIA and NSA to collect evidence on aliens and interview witnesses who have claimed to have seen or come in contact with UFOs. One of the most popular files in the FBI vault is the Guy Hotel memo. The memo was from March 22nd, 1950, from Special Agent Guy Hotel. It was marked to J. Edgar Hoover. In the memo, he said that 3 flying saucers were recovered from New Mexico. Each saucer was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape, but were only 3 feet tall and were dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Sounds like they found aliens to me. Moving on to number 3, we have the 6 FBI agents. Just recently, it was revealed that 6 FBI agents apparently solicited and trafficked while on an assignment overseas. And then they were caught lying about it. Out of the agents accused of misconduct, 2 resigned, 2 retired, and 1 was removed while the Inspector General was investigating the incidents. And I think the last agent just knew what was going on and failed to report it. But since news broke literally 3 days ago, at the time of me recording this, there isn't much more information about this case. It's just massively shocking that FBI agents are engaging in illegal activities, but also does not surprise me. Moving on to number 2, we have the Alcatraz escape. Alcatraz is known as being an intense supermax prison. From 1934 to 1963, 36 men tried to escape. Either they were caught or they died trying. So it was thought to be impossible to escape from. That was until June of 1962. 3 inmates, John Anglin, his brother Clarence, and Frank Morris escaped. They put dummy heads they had made out of plaster and flesh-tone paint in their beds to fool the night guards. They then crawled through ventilation ducts beneath their sinks that they had been widening for quite some time. Then they got out to an unmonitored corridor and they hopped over the cell wall. They then used a raft that they made using over 50 raincoats among other stolen and donated items, and they set off into the waters. The prisoners were never caught. The FBI files on this case suggest that they didn't make it to land for a number of reasons. Number 1, the cold water and strong currents would have made it hard for them to cross. 2, when on land, they would have probably stole clothes or a car, and neither of this was reported happening. And 3, if they did escape, they would have no money to support themselves. For 17 years, the FBI worked on this case. They officially closed it on December 31st, 1979. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Louie Louie. Louie Louie is a song written by Richard Berry in 1955. Now, what does this have anything to do with today's list? Well, this song was actually the subject of an FBI investigation for more than 2 years in the mid-1960s. If you listen to the song, it's pretty hard to understand what they're saying. Soon rumors were flying that the song was actually a secret dirty message. It was banned from playing on radios, and the FBI investigated the song and the band members. The FBI spent 2 years analyzing the song. They would play it at different speeds or play it backwards to try and decode the song. They finally gave up. So they wasted more than 2 years working on the case of a potentially dirty song. Ooh.
Coming in at number 10, we have the escape from Alcatraz. Now, if there's one place you didn't want to end up if you did something rotten, it's Alcatraz. We've all heard of it, the inescapable island used as a prison for extreme convicts in the USA. That is until June 2nd, 1962, when 3 men somehow did the unimaginable: escape Alcatraz. Brothers John and Frank Anglin, along with Frank Morris, all escaped this island, and to this day, the mystery remains, you guessed it, unsolved. Apparently, they had an arts and crafts club in Alcatraz because the men had made dummies out of plaster, flesh-colored paint, and real human hair designed to make them look asleep. They were pretty good. As soon as guards discovered they were missing, the whole place shut down and they began their search. Fortunately for the investigation, but unfortunately for the guy who got left behind. One of them didn't make it out in time, so he helped fill in the gaps. The group began planning in December and fashioned a makeshift drill out of a broken vacuum and loosened the vents at the back of their cells. After sneaking out through the vents, they ran ran down a typically unguarded corridor and made their way to the rooftop towards their secret workshop. They used over 50 raincoats to fashion makeshift life vests and a rubber raft to help them cross the shark-infested water surrounding the island. They also built wooden paddles and used a musical instrument as a way of inflating the raft. Navigating through a series of shafts to get to the rear of the cell house, the men then climbed over the fence with their gear and sailed away to freedom. So to be fair, they did find out how the men made their escape, but whether they actually made it remains a mystery. Their plan once they got to land included stealing clothes in a car, but no thefts were made. Since their escape, no trace of them has ever been found.
In our 9th spot, we have the wire fail. This next story about the FBI is literally gonna make you facepalm. So basically, in 2010, Brooks Kellogg was accused of hiring a hitman to try and murder a coworker who sued him for $2.5 million. So the FBI decided to do a sting operation to get Kellogg to confess to his wrongdoings. So they sent an undercover agent in with a hidden camera and audio equipment. Only problem is that there was a faulty wire. Now, wouldn't you think that they would double, even triple check to make sure that there were no technical issues before sending him in? But they didn't, so it didn't record audio during the confrontation. As a result, he was almost let off the hook. In our 8th spot today, we have the fantasy tape. In 2008, the FBI was investigating an unsolved murder case when a tape was sent to them. On the tape, it sounded like someone getting tortured. Ultimately, they thought that this tape had to do with the unsolved case that they were working on. Boy, were they wrong, and it's embarrassing. Turns out that the tape actually belonged to a Tennessee judge. His secretary handed it over to the police after she was fired, and it's not of someone being tortured. The judge had made a tape of his sexual fantasies. Apparently, the tape contained, and I quote, graphic, erotic situations intertwined with legal dictation made by now former Judge Hagler. Due to this scandal, the judge did resign. How embarrassing for both the judge and the FBI, who thought that it was a solid lead. In our 7th spot, we have Whitey Bulger Part 2. So like I mentioned, this guy was an organized crime figure that also was an informant for the FBI. And the FBI knew that. In fact, they ignored that side of him if he promised to give them information about the inner workings of an Italian American crime family. There's just a lot of things that they let slide with this guy that they definitely shouldn't have. Plus, one of the reasons why he was on the run in the first place was because his former FBI handler told him that they were coming for him. So he fled and went into hiding for 16 years. Imagine that. Coming in at number 6, we have Christine Collins. In 1928, a woman named Christine Collins made headlines after her young son, Walter Collins, went missing. At that time, the FBI was dealing with a number of scandals, so they thought, hey, if we find this woman's missing son, that would look so great on us. In the end, they ended up finding her son and returning him to her. Only problem, it wasn't her son. The FBI was like, nonsense, this is your boy, you're just delusional. So they locked her in a psychiatric ward for 10 days. That's when it was revealed that the boy was indeed not her son. Sadly, her son was actually kidnapped and then murdered in a series of murders known as the Wineville Chicken Coop murders. But imagine that, like, you're crazy, lock her up, it is her son. Come on, man. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Beltway Snipers. These were a series of coordinated shootings that occurred over the course of 23 days in October of 2002. 2 snipers randomly shot 13 people. 10 sadly died, while 3 survived but were left in critical condition. One of the victims was FBI intelligence analyst Linda Franklin. Fear quickly spread in the area, and the FBI was facing immense pressure to catch these guys before more people wound up dead. They were finally caught on October 24th of 2002 when the 2 men were found sleeping in their car at 3:15 a.m. 3 weeks to find cold-blooded killers, it seems kind of short, but the FBI was under tons of public pressure and were heavily scrutinized for not catching them sooner. In our 4th spot, we have the corruption. Just a couple of years ago, an ex-FBI special agent, Babak Bromund, was arrested after it was found that he was accepting bribes linked to an Armenian criminal organization. Not only that, but he was falsifying documents to cover up these bribes. He ended up being charged with 3 counts of making false statements to a government agency to cover his bribes, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit commit bribery of a public official. It was found that a lawyer linked to the criminal organization made regular bribe payments to and purchased gifts for Babbitt while he was an FBI agent working on national security matters. The lawyer apparently bought him a $36,000 motorcycle and paid him $30,000 for a down payment on a second home in Lake Tahoe. All this among other things. In return, Babbitt would do things for him like diffuse any law enforcement interests in him, and he would also search the FBI database and find out what dirt they had on him and others. In our third spot, we have Larry Nassar. Back in 2015, news broke that young women, a part of the USA gymnastics team, were being taken advantage of by gym owners, coaches, and staff, one of them being Larry Nassar. Larry is said to have taken advantage of at least 250 young women since 1992, and apparently the FBI severely mishandled this case. For example, in July of 2015, the FBI were first notified about the allegations against Larry. It took them until September 2016 until they started to actually investigate him. By then, 70 more athletes were taken advantage of by him. Not only that, but he was caught lying to the FBI on multiple occasions, and they did nothing about that. An attorney for 150 of the women called the FBI out and said, and I quote, "When an ordinary American citizen lies to the FBI in the course of an investigation, they are prosecuted. Yet no charges have been filed against anyone as a result of this 5-year investigation." In our second spot, we have Stoneman Douglas High School. In February of 2018, Nicholas Cruz went into Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland and shot at the students and staff. As a result, 17 people were killed and 17 more were left injured. Well, it turns out that the FBI had received a tip a month prior to the shooting. The tip told the FBI about Cruz's gun ownership, his desire to kill people, his erratic behavior, and even his social media posts, which were disturbing. All the signs of him conducting a school were there, and they handed it to the FBI, and they basically did nothing. The FBI even admitted that they did not follow proper protocol on this tip. Had they might have been able to prevent this from happening. And in our number one spot today, we have Viola Liuzzo. Between 1960 and 1965, an FBI informant, Gary Thomas Rowe, was given the task to infiltrate the Ku Klan. He then was to report to the FBI information on the group members and their activities. But he was told not to participate in attacks or violent situations. But he ignored this. In 1965, a white woman named Viola Liuzzo was murdered by this Klan. They had fired shots into her car after noticing her passenger was a young black man. Gary was there when it happened, and he became an accessory to murder. To make matters worse, the FBI spread rumors that the victim, Viola, was a heroin addict, a member of the Communist Party, and that she abandoned her children to have sexual relationships with African Americans involved in the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, she was a civil rights worker that just wanted to help people, and all that stuff was just made up by the FBI.
Starting off this countdown, we have Carmen Gallanty. The FBI case file on Carmen Gallanty is incredibly detailed. They got everything from his birthplace to his draft registration. Carmen was an American mobster, otherwise called the Cigar, because he was always seen with a cigar in hand or in his mouth. This guy has a long career of violence and potentially murder, which is why the FBI was on him. They were tracking his every move. They think that he committed over 80 murders. In 1960, he was convicted of drug trafficking. After his release in 1974, he became New York's organized crime top boss. However, his life of crime ended on July 12, 1979, after he was assassinated by his rivals.
Coming in at number 9, we have the Anthrax Care. This was a case that the FBI let in right through the front door and still couldn't solve it. Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle had no idea what was about to happen next when he received a letter on October 15, 2001. Unbeknownst to him, this letter was laced with anthrax, a serious infectious disease. The worst part was he wasn't the only one to receive a letter like this, and 5 people died and 13 people fell ill via these mail attacks. Some even suspect that even more people received these letters but did not fall ill due to the poor quality of the anthrax. The next few years would consist of many lawsuits, and they still had no clear idea of who the culprit might be. That is until Bruce Ivins, a government scientist and suspect, committed suicide. They thought they had him, but even a pool of scientists couldn't confirm that Ivins indeed did it. They still don't know to this day. And coming in at number 8, missing Tammy J. Swiggy. Almost 30 years ago, the case of Tammy J remains unsolved and is still undergoing investigation. Investigators hope that by using updated technology, they may be able to uncover new clues regarding her murder. In August of 1992, Tammy's Pontiac was found abandoned on the side of the road, and her body was later discovered in Missouri, 500 miles away. Despite over 200 pieces of physical evidence, they still can't uncover a single trace of who her killer was. The only piece of significant DNA they found was a beer can nearby, but there was no one they could match the DNA to in their criminal database. Even still, the police are unsure as to whether it even relates to the case. The closest they've come to finding the killer was when officers arrested Clark Perry Baldwin, a 58-year-old man they tied to 3 murders and potentially a 4th he committed between Tennessee and Wyoming. But still, in many regards, the murder of Tammy J remains open. We have to talk about the Black Dahlia. January 15th, 1947, the severed body of 22-year-old aspiring actress Elizabeth Short was found by a mother and child going for a walk in LA. She would later be dubbed the Black Dahlia, as Elizabeth was often noted to wear black clothing and because of the movie Blue Dahlia, which was out at the time. Despite the harm done to the body, it was obvious that she was not killed where she was found, as there was no blood at the crime scene. Due to the precision and apparent expertise of the murder, many investigators believe it had to be someone in a medical field. But sadly, despite a massive manhunt and countless investigations, the culprit was never found. But even to this day, many people remain passionate about uncovering the true murderer. Steve Hodel, for example, a retired Los Angeles police detective, has developed a captivating case that the murderer was indeed his own father, George Hodel. George Hodel was an impressive doctor in his field, but left his son and family behind when Steve was 9. When Steve found old photos in a bound wooden case of a woman with a striking resemblance to Short, he had to investigate. Despite the evidence he has produced, no one can really claim for sure Dr. Hodel was the murderer. But what if? Cold Valley disappearances. Lewis Clark Valley was nicknamed Cold Valley after a string of disappearances from 1979 to 1982 left the country astounded. 5 people disappeared, but only 3 of the bodies were ever found with no culprit to name. The first of the disappearance was Christina White, who never arrived home, and her schoolwork was found scattered on the outskirts of Osoden. She and her bike were never found. Then Kristen David never finished her bike ride from Moscow, Idaho to Lewis Clark Valley, and her body was discovered by a fisherman who found it floating in a garbage bag in Snake River. Then sisters Nelson and Brandy Miller disappeared while walking to the grocery store, while Stephen Purcell, a friend of the 2 women, also disappeared that night. The bodies of the sisters were found off the side of a highway near Kendrick, Idaho. FBI and the police believe the cases to be linked due to the similarities the victims shared, and Detective Nichols believes that all evidence points to one perpetrator, but she won't reveal his name until enough evidence has been found. But that's just the problem, there is barely any evidence to collect. Despite Nichols' beliefs, some investigators believe there were different killers, but no one can be sure. The case remains unsolved to this day. The Berkshire UFO sighting. Now we've talked about the cases the FBI couldn't solve, but what about the ones they didn't want to? This is one of the most famous alien abductions the world has ever seen, and no one can really deny it. In 1969, Tom Reed in Berkshire, Massachusetts was riding in the car with his brother, mother, and grandmother. As they were crossing the Sheffield Bridge, they caught sight of some mysterious lights coming up from behind them. Suddenly, the environment changed, and it felt like they were in the middle of the hurricane. Next thing, they remember they were back in the car, his mother and grandmother had switched places, and realized that over 2 hours had passed. All they could recall were images of being in a hangar with people around. Several eyewitnesses also saw the lights, and even a few media outlets covered the phenomenon. But what's even creepier is that a memo written by Guy Hoddle, the head of the field office in Washington, wrote a report in 1950, 10 years earlier, that stated that 3 flying saucers were recovered in New Mexico, but the FBI never followed up on it. Could it be that these flying saucers had something to do with the mysterious events of Tom Reed, or was there a reason the FBI didn't give this case the attention it deserved? Guess we won't know, will we? Coming in at number 7, the LaSalle Street murders. There's a lot of murder, I'm sorry guys, but it's here. In 1971, Bob Gurse, Bob Hinson, and James Barker were all found murdered at their home. Their only hint? A bloody footprint left behind. The 3 men all worked together, and considering there were no signs of breaking and entering, the police then assumed that they also knew the murderer. Upon their first interrogations, their primary suspect became Theodore B. Uland, who said he last spoke to Hinson at 9 and Gurse at 9:30. Hinson and Gurse had both worked for him, and police began to suspect that Uland had financial motivations, as he blamed the men for stealing equipment, and that he had a life insurance policy out on his 2 former employees. It was discovered that Hinson, Gers, and Barker all were notorious parties who left a series of lovers in their wake. It was then considered that perhaps a jealous lover or husband took revenge on the three men. They then discovered that one of those women visited the house around 1 a.m. but left when there was no answer. The biggest obstacle to this case was the lack of technology, as the police were not equipped with forensics at this time, which meant that the amount of legwork that they were required to do slowed the case down substantially. As a result, the murders remain unsolved. Coming in at number 3, the Hall Mills murder. Investigators initially thought that this 1920s case was a lover's quarrel gone wrong, but no sooner did things get a lot more complicated. In 1922, Reverend Edward W. Hall, who was a pastor in New Brunswick, and Eleanor R. Mills were found murdered. Their bodies were discovered lying side by side, dressed very neatly, near a crabapple tree, a spot considered ideal for lovers. Torn love letters were scattered among their perfectly placed bodies, and they soon found out that the letters were addressed to each other. Both Eleanor and Edward were married, however, so as news of their ardent romance hit the tabloids, the town went wild. The police were confident. They were like, this is easy, we're gonna solve this in 2 days tops. 4 years later, still nothing. His wife was accused, who suspiciously had some of her clothes sent off and re-dyed. His rich brother with a short fuse was a suspect. The only witness was a woman named Jane Gibson, who said she saw 4 people but the crabapple tree after following a suspicious figure around her farm nearby. She then heard a gunshot, followed by screams of a woman. But then her story started changing here and there, and anyways, enough people were accused that they really never got straight down to the story. So I guess sadly, we will never know. Coming in at number 2, the Tylenol tamperings. This next mystery inspired the phrase, "do not use if seal is broken." The Tylenol murders of 1982 changed the game. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman complained of a sore throat one morning, so her parents gave her 1 extra strength Tylenol. Unbeknownst to them, however, it was laced with cyanide, and sadly Mary passed away. What soon followed was a series of Tylenol-related deaths, all including cyanide poisoning. Fortunately, any bottles containing traces of the substances were removed before anyone else made this deadly mistake, but police still wondered how. The only link they found was a man named James Lewis, who wrote a ransom letter for $1 million to Johnson & Johnson claiming to be the killer, but considering he had no relationship to Chicago, which is where the murders took place, he was instead charged with extortion. But still, police believe that someone must have taken the bottles off the shelves and tampered with them, but the case remains unsolved. And last but not least, we have the Zodiac Killer. If you're a fan of all cases cold, well then you've heard of the Zodiac Killer. I mean, there's a movie about it. Between 68 and 69, the Zodiac Killer chose 7 victims in the northern part of California, and luckily 2 victims survived. This cryptic killer gained notoriety by plaguing investigators with ciphers, threats, letters, and information. The Zodiac even phoned the police and admitted to the killings. He loved the attention and threatened to collect more victims should the police not allow his ciphers to be published. The Zodiac Killer is said to have claimed over 37 lives, though no further victims have been found since 1969. This publicity-obsessed murderer left police chilled and confused, and continues to boggle minds of investigators to this day.